The studio lights were warm. Too warm. The audience murmured like a pot about to boil. This wasn't a regular night at Real Time with Bill Maher. The producers knew it. The interns knew it. Even the camera operators had been warned, stay tight. No sudden cuts. Let this one breathe. Because tonight, Bill Maher was sitting across from Denzel Washington, and everyone felt it. Maher leaned back, his usual half-smirk already in place. So, Denzel, he started, you've been making headlines lately, talking about manipulation, control, people being slaves to information. Sounds a bit dramatic, don't you think? The crowd chuckled. Maher fed off it. But Denzel didn't smile. He didn't blink. He just leaned forward, hands clasped together like he was holding the weight of something ancient. Is it dramatic, Bill, he said slowly, or is it just inconvenient? The room tensed. Maher raised his eyebrows. I mean, come on, man. You're a Hollywood icon. A national treasure. And yet you sound like a man who just discovered YouTube conspiracy videos. A few scattered laughs. But even they felt unsure now. Denzel's voice dropped an octave. You joke. But while you're joking, people are bleeding. Kids in the street. Veterans who can't sleep. Whole communities ignored until they burn. Silence. No music. No cut to commercial. Maher tried to pivot. I'm not saying there aren't problems. I'm saying it helps to laugh sometimes. To cope. You cope from comfort, Denzel replied sharply. They cope from trauma. That line sliced through the room like a blade. The live audience was no longer giggling. They were watching. Denzel wasn't here to play celebrity games. He wasn't here to trend. He was here for war. And Maher, for the first time in years, looked like a man who had underestimated his guest. Bill Maher shifted in his seat, that trademark confidence flickering for a second behind his eyes. But he recovered, or at least tried to. Okay, he said, exhaling, so what, you think late-night hosts are the enemy now? His tone was lighter, but there was a sharpness buried underneath. The kind that says I'm not done yet. Denzel didn't flinch. I think jokes have consequences when they come from people who've never had to live with the punchline. The crowd murmured, a low, slow ripple of realization. Denzel wasn't just calling out Maher, he was indicting a whole system. The media. The detached tone. The smirking commentary while the world burns outside studio walls. Maher leaned forward now, hands open, voice faster. But don't you think we need some distance? If everything's always life and death, we lose perspective. You get eaten alive. Perspective? Denzel repeated. Tell that to the mother who just lost her son to a stray bullet while two talking heads debated crime statistics over cocktails. That one hit hard. Maher tried to smile, but his grin didn't match his eyes. All right, but Denzel, man, you're preaching. You sound like a guy who's done with movies and ready to run for office. Denzel's answer came swift, almost cold. I'm not running. I'm reminding. A silence fell again. And then Denzel turned slightly toward the audience, not the camera, the people. The real ones. He scanned them like a man not asking for applause but making sure they were awake. I've played soldiers, lawyers, kings. But the hardest role in this country? A black man trying to speak truth without being turned into a meme. Gasps. Audible now. This wasn't a debate. This was a dismantling. Bill Maher blinked. And for a split second, he looked small. Bill Maher let out a short, awkward laugh, not because he found it funny, but because silence had become unbearable. All right, but isn't that the point of this show? Debate, disagreement, clash of ideas? You bring your fire, I bring my sarcasm, and somewhere in the middle people find truth. Denzel tilted his head slightly, considering that for a moment. No, he said calmly. That's the illusion. The audience leaned in. What you're describing sounds noble. Civil discourse. Iron sharpens iron. But what it's become? Theater. You ask loaded questions. You mock from a distance. Then you cut to commercial before anything can get too real. Maher opened his mouth but stopped. Denzel wasn't finished. It's not a clash of ideas when one man's joke is another man's reality. When you reduce real pain to a punchline, you're not a commentator. You're an accomplice. That word, accomplice, echoed. Maher's brow furrowed. His voice tightened. You're saying I'm part of the problem? I'm saying you don't get to sit in a climate-controlled studio and dismiss suffering with a smirk, then act surprised when people stop laughing. Denzel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His control was the tension. A woman in the front row had tears in her eyes. Someone in the back whispered, "Damn." Maher fidgeted with his notes. Reached for water. Sipped. Then said, almost defensively. So what's the solution, Denzel? We stop joking? Cancel comedy? Denzel stared. No, Bill. You stop hiding behind it. For a moment, it felt like no one in the room was breathing. The tension in the studio was no longer just emotional, it was physical. You could feel it in the way the cameramen gripped their rigs, in how the audience sat forward, elbows on knees, eyes locked. This wasn't a political segment anymore. This was an autopsy. Bill Maher tried to pivot again. Look, Denzel, I've had activists, revolutionaries, war veterans on this stage. You think I'm scared of a little heat? I welcome it. Denzel's eyes narrowed, the way a man looks at someone who just doesn't get it. Heat isn't the problem, Bill. The problem is you think inviting the fire is the same as feeling the burn. Another audible gasp. You've built a career on making discomfort entertaining. But there's a difference between provoking thought and poking wounds. Maher sat back, lips pressed into a tight line. The audience had stopped responding. They weren't clapping. They weren't laughing. They were listening. Denzel pressed on. You want to be the guy who tells it like it is, right? Then tell them this. While you debate both sides, kids are drinking lead water. While you joke about cancel culture, people are getting canceled from life, evicted, erased, executed, quietly. And while you laugh at woke politics, some of us are just trying to stay awake. Bill opened his mouth to interject. But Denzel raised his hand. Just slightly. Calm. Steady. You invited me here for a conversation. So I'm talking. And I won't let the format save you from the truth. And there it was, the shift. This wasn't Denzel the actor. This wasn't even Denzel the icon. This was Denzel the mirror. And Maher, for all his wit, all his monologues, all his decades in the game, had no comeback ready. Bill Maher finally leaned in, his hands folded tightly. The playful arrogance he was known for had all but evaporated. He cleared his throat and said, more seriously this time. You make a lot of heavy points, Denzel. I'm not dismissing that. But surely you know people watch this show to get away from the heaviness. To laugh. To breathe. Denzel didn't blink. And that's the lie, he said. That laughter is escape. But when you're laughing at someone else's pain, you're not escaping, you're indulging. A man in the back row whispered, "Whoa," like it slipped out of his chest. Maher gestured toward the crew, the cameras, the set. So what then? Tear down the whole thing? Burn it all? Denzel shook his head slowly. No. Just stop pretending it's not on fire. He sat back for the first time, not relaxed, but planted. Grounded. Like his presence alone was a statement. You want to be brave? Try telling a joke that punches up. Try confronting your own biases, not just the ones convenient to mock. Try holding space for voices that don't sound like yours. Maher sighed. A long, tired exhale. I thought you came here to talk about unity. I did, Denzel replied. But unity without truth is just silence in a different costume. That line didn't just hit the room. It pierced it. The audience didn't cheer. They didn't boo. They just sat in it. The silence after Denzel spoke was louder than any applause break. And that silence was earned. Maher sat back, suddenly older, suddenly less in control. Because for once, it wasn't his show anymore. It was Denzel's. Bill Maher stared at the desk for a moment, as if trying to remember which part of the script came next, but there was no script anymore. Denzel had torn it to pieces and scattered the pages like ashes across the studio floor. All right, Maher muttered, trying to keep his composure. So we sit in the pain. We look in the mirror. Then what? People need something to do, Denzel. Something real. Denzel's voice softened, but the weight of his words doubled. Then listen. Really listen. Not just for a reply, but for understanding. Stop giving airtime to caricatures just because they bring in ratings. Give it to people who bleed truth even when it's inconvenient. Maher sat up. So what, you're saying I platform the wrong voices? Denzel nodded once. I'm saying if your platform only echoes you, it's not a platform. It's a pedestal. Another murmur from the audience. Several heads nodded. One person even whispered, "That's deep." The camera slowly zoomed in on Denzel. I'm not perfect, Bill. I've played roles. I've stayed silent when I should have spoken. I've smiled for cameras when my soul ached. But I'm not doing that anymore. Not here. Not now. Maher, almost sarcastically, asked. So this is your reckoning tour? Denzel leaned in just slightly, calm, deadly accurate. No. This is your reminder that platforms like yours can elevate, or erase. And that choice? It's made every episode. The studio had forgotten the concept of time. What had been scheduled as a segment had become something else, raw, uncomfortable, alive. The producers in the control room didn't dare cue a commercial. The floor manager stood frozen, headset halfway to his mouth. No one wanted to be the one to interrupt this moment. Because whether Maher knew it or not. Denzel had just taken the stage. Bill Maher rubbed his temple, visibly trying to recalibrate. This wasn't the usual sparring match he enjoyed, this was a dissection. And Denzel was doing it without shouting, without grandstanding. He was wielding truth like a scalpel. Okay, Maher said cautiously, but if we're being honest, the audience doesn't always want truth. They want entertainment. They want relief. Denzel's response was immediate. Then don't call it a political show. Call it a distraction circus. Be real about what you're selling. Oof. The audience stirred again. You want to talk politics, Bill? Then talk about the real cost. Not just legislation and headlines. Talk about the father working 3 jobs who still can't pay rent. Talk about the teenager hiding his trauma behind humor until it breaks him. Talk about the system that laughs while they fall. The audience shifted uncomfortably. This was no longer a debate. It was a mirror being held up, and it was not flattering. Maher tried again, a little more defensive now. But isn't it dangerous to be this serious, this intense, all the time? Don't people burn out? Denzel nodded slightly. They do. That's why comedy should exist. But not as anesthesia. Not when people are still bleeding. A heavy silence returned, one that couldn't be shaken off. You don't have to stop joking, Bill, Denzel added. Just stop pretending that your jokes don't land on someone's back. The sentence sat there. Still. Unforgiving. Maher, who'd spent decades turning sharp words into applause, suddenly had none of his usual weapons left. The quips, the monologues, the eye rolls, they'd all collapsed in front of a man who wasn't playing a role. Because Denzel wasn't acting. He was remembering. And making sure the rest of America did too. The audience sat on the edge of their seats now, not because they were waiting for a joke, but because they knew one wasn't coming. Whatever this was, it had shifted the energy of the entire show. Denzel had hijacked the format without ever raising his voice. Maher leaned back, exhaling sharply. You realize, he said, some people will call this an overreaction. That you're turning a comedy show into a sermon. Denzel didn't hesitate. And they'll do that because it's easier to call a warning a lecture than to listen to it. Maher tried to smile, but it faltered halfway through. I'm just saying, we can't carry the weight of the world every night. Denzel's gaze locked onto him. No, but we can stop pretending it's not there. The camera slowly pushed in on his face, no theatrics, no lights flickering, no dramatic music. Just conviction. This isn't about politics. It's not about race baiting or outrage culture. It's about integrity. Yours. Mine. Everybody's. And when you joke while people bleed, you're not edgy. You're complicit. A few gasps. One person clapped. Then two. But Denzel held up a hand and they stopped. Don't applaud. Apply it. He wasn't here for cheers. He was here to interrupt comfort. People like you, Bill, you say the world's too sensitive now. I say it finally started feeling. That one hit deep. Maher's hands were now clasped tightly, his notes untouched, his usual smirk completely gone. And if we don't feel this now, Denzel said, eyes narrowing, then we'll be forced to feel something worse later. A hush swept over the room. Even the control booth was silent, not a cue, not a whisper. It was clear, this was no longer just an interview. It was an intervention. For the first time in the entire segment, Bill Maher didn't reply immediately. He stared down at his desk, fingers drumming nervously. His face looked older, smaller, as if the weight of Denzel's words had found a place to land. You know, he finally said, voice lower than before, people say I'm jaded. That I've seen too much to care anymore. Denzel leaned in, voice level, unflinching. Caring isn't a phase, Bill. It's a choice. Every day. Maher looked up. And what if you're tired of choosing? Then rest. But don't mock those who still stand. The audience froze again. Not a whisper. Denzel pressed on, his tone almost gentle, but with steel underneath. You don't have to agree with me. But if your first instinct is to mock pain, you've forgotten your power. And that makes you dangerous, not funny. Maher blinked, visibly shaken. So what do I do? He asked, for once, with sincerity. Denzel paused. Just long enough. You listen. You learn. And then you use your mic like it matters, because it does. And in that moment, it was like the entire room had taken a breath they didn't know they were holding. Denzel sat back, arms crossed loosely. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't angry. He was done. And that, somehow, carried more weight than any insult ever could. Bill Maher nodded slightly. For the first time, he didn't look like the smartest man in the room. He looked like a man finally hearing something no one else had dared to say, and realizing it was already too late to cut to commercial. The lights hadn't dimmed, but the atmosphere had. You could feel it in the shoulders of the audience, in the silence of the production crew, in the lack of camera cuts or cue cards. The studio had transformed into something sacred, a place where truth demanded space. Bill Maher exhaled again. Not a theatrical sigh, a real one. The kind that says, "I didn't expect this." "I guess I brought you here expecting a conversation," he said slowly. "But you brought something else." Denzel nodded. "I brought a mirror." Maher shook his head slightly, almost smiling now, not with sarcasm, but with surrender. "And you made damn sure I looked into it." "You asked for honesty," Denzel replied. "I gave you mine." He stood up. No fanfare. No swelling music. Just presence. As he adjusted his jacket, he turned to the audience, not for applause, but as if to include them in the reckoning. "You all watched this show 100 times. Maybe you laughed, maybe you cringed. But tonight, you listened. And maybe next time, you'll speak." A few people stood. A quiet standing ovation, not loud, not performative, just earned. Bill remained seated. He looked up at Denzel with the faintest nod. "You changed the tone of this room." Denzel smiled. Then maybe it needed changing. He walked off stage, slow, firm, deliberate. No exit music. No jokes. Just a shadow of purpose left behind. And for the first time in years, Bill Maher didn't have the last word. In a world flooded with noise, sometimes the silence says the most. Denzel Washington didn't come to entertain, he came to expose. And tonight, he reminded millions watching that the loudest voice isn't always the one shouting. Sometimes, it's the one that dares to speak the truth.